Great, thank you all for being here. My name is Emily Liquin. I'm a postdoc at New York University, and I'm going to be talking about some work I've been doing with Todd Garekis on where questions come from. So questions are ubiquitous and they're useful. So we ask questions all the time. We ask our teachers questions in the classroom. We ask our friends for advice. We ask Google things online. And by asking questions and getting answers to our questions, we're able to gain useful information, which helps us learn things about the world and solve problems. But even though question asking is something we do all the time, if we take a step back and kind of think about it, question asking is really challenging. So just to give one example, if I need my partner's help figuring out what to buy at the grocery store, there's a really huge number of possible questions I could ask, ranging from things that are potentially informative, like what do you want for dinner, or do we have onions, to things that are probably irrelevant, like where are my glasses, or what's 2 plus 2. And so the challenge that we're facing is that we want to find the single most informative question that's going to help us learn what we want to learn or solve the problem that we're trying to solve. But in order to find that question, we need to wade through this really massive space of possible questions. And so I think this challenge raises a question for cognitive science, which is, how do people know what questions to ask? And so I think this question really has kind of 3 parts. So first, what does the space of possible questions even look like? Second, how do we search this space of possible questions? And third, how do we know when we've actually found a good question? And I'd like to argue that prior research has provided us with some proposals to address 2 of these questions. So first, it's been argued that the space of possible questions is defined by a compositional grammar. And essentially what this means is that we can break down questions into smaller conceptual building blocks, like Lego blocks, and then we can recombine those building blocks to form new ways to generate questions. And so, for example, we could break down the question, do we have onions, into a building block for do we have X, where X is some item, and a separate conceptual building block for onions. And we can think of different ways that we could combine these building blocks to form new questions. Okay, it's also been argued that we evaluate questions in a way that's well described by optimal metrics like expected information gain. In other words, we know when we've found a good question because we can evaluate how informative it is. The second question, though, how do we search the space of possible questions, I think remains kind of unanswered, and that's the question that I'm going to address today. Before I go into trying to answer this question, I just want to motivate why this is an important question to think about. So first, question asking is a really important way that we direct our own learning, but there's also evidence that we don't always ask very good questions, especially in real-world settings like in the classroom. And so if we understand how people ask questions, we might be able to devise strategies to help people potentially search the space of possible questions in a way that's better for learning. Second, there are a lot of problems that humans face every day that rely on a kind of large-scale space of possibilities that we have to search through, things like hypothesis generation, decision-making, even creativity. And so understanding the search process in the space of question asking might provide us with some generalizable insights that can help shed light on how we search more generally through spaces of possibilities. Okay, so how do we search the space of possible questions? So the answer to this question that I want to put forward is that we search the space of possible questions in a way that's guided by reuse. This hypothesis is inspired by prior research on decision-making, problem-solving, and inference, which shows that people do often reuse previous solutions. So for example, if I'm deciding what to cook for dinner tonight, I might think of dinners that I've cooked in the past. But reuse hasn't really been explored in the context of question asking, and as a result, we don't know as much about how reuse works, especially in this kind of system that has this compositional structure where questions are made up of these smaller building blocks. And so in the case of question asking, how might reuse guide our search through the space of possible questions? Well, first, people might simply reuse previously asked questions in a kind of straightforward way. So if I ask a question at one time, say I ask, do we have onions when I'm going grocery shopping on Monday? Then later that week, say on Friday, I might ask, do we have onions again? Or I might ask a question like, do we have rice, which essentially takes the same form, but might swap out some minimal part of the content. And so if this is the case, if people reuse previously asked questions, this can help answer how we search the space of possible questions by showing us a way we might kind of narrow down this space to make the search kind of more manageable. But I think this probably can't be the whole story, right? Because previously asked questions aren't always going to be informative in any new situation we face. And so we might say we only reuse previously asked questions when they're reasonably informative for the new situation we found ourselves in. So what about when we can't reuse previously asked questions? I'd like to argue that because we're in this compositional system, we still might be able to guide our search by reuse, but now I'd like to propose that we might construct novel questions by specifically reusing the conceptual building blocks from previously asked questions. So to give an example of this, if we ask, do we have onions when going grocery shopping on Monday? Then on Friday, we might be more likely to ask a question like, do we have the ingredients for pizza? Compared to a question like, when did you last buy garlic? And the reason for this would be that the first question still contains this like, do we have X conceptual building block that we're reusing in this new situation, while the latter question doesn't. Okay, so to summarize in the work that I'm going to be talking about today, we're going to be asking two questions corresponding to the two hypotheses that I presented on the previous slide. So first, we'll ask, do people reuse previously asked questions when these questions are reasonably informative? And when asking novel questions, do people reuse conceptual building blocks from previously asked questions? To answer these questions, we conducted a study with adults online. The basic structure of the study is that we exposed participants to some questions in a question exposure task, and then we had participants complete a question asking task. And what we want to know is how exposure to a particular set of questions affects later question asking. In particular, do people reuse questions and question building blocks from the exposure task when they get to the question asking task? To serve as a control, we gave another group of participants the same tasks, but in the reverse order. We still included both tasks to keep the overall study the same length, but what we can see here is that we can contrast having exposure prior to the question asking task and having no exposure prior to the question asking task in the second condition. We also have two different versions of the exposure task where participants are exposed to two different sets of questions, which I'll call set 1 and set 2. So I'll call these the exposure 1 condition and the exposure 2 condition. And again, this will help us test how particular questions are reused in the question asking task. Okay, so this is kind of an abstract overview. So what are these actual tasks? So in the study, we use the battleship task, which has been used in prior research to study information search and question asking. The basic structure of this task is you see a 6x6 game board, and on each board there are 3 hidden ships, a red ship, a blue ship, and a purple ship. Each of the ships is 2, 3, or 4 tiles long and positioned horizontally or vertically. So basically one of these red ships is positioned somewhere. Oh, can you not see the board? Okay, that's weird. There's like supposed to be a gray game board that looks kind of like that, but blank in the middle. That would make it hard to figure out what's going on, sorry. So one of the red ships is like positioned on this 6x6 game board, one of the blue ships, one of the purple ships. So these are some like possible game boards. In total, there are 1.6 million possible boards, and your task is figuring out like what the actual configuration of the ships are. So to use this as a question asking task, everywhere that's a blank white square is supposed to be a light gray square. Sorry. So you're shown a partially revealed board. So basically you see where some of the ships are. The dark gray color means there's no ship there. And anywhere that is showing up as white on the screen, or perhaps people on Zoom can see the light gray, I'm not sure, are tiles that haven't been revealed. And so at this stage, you can ask one question that's going to help reveal where the ships are located on this board. And so, for example, you might ask something like, are any of the ships touching? How many of the ships are horizontal? Or how long is the purple ship? And so in this case, since you only see one purple tile, for example, you don't know if it's 2 tiles long, 3 tiles long, or 4 tiles long. Cool, so this is the question asking task that participants complete. Participants see a partially revealed game board, and then they're prompted to ask a question to help figure out where the ships are, which they just type into a text box. And this is repeated with 10 different boards. I'm sorry, this is like completely indecipherable. Great. How the exposure task works is really, really similar. So participants see a partially revealed board, but this time instead of asking a question themselves, they're provided with 3 different questions, and they have to sort those questions according to how informative they are for the particular board. In other words, how helpful they're going to be for revealing where the ships are. And this is repeated for 6 different boards, which I'm trying to show here. Cool, so critically in the exposure task, the participant always sees variants of the same 3 questions, and those questions differ between question sets 1 and 2. So in question set 1, participants always see the questions, are any of the ships touching? How many ships are 2, 3, or 4 tiles long? at what location is the bottom right part of the color ship. And in question set 2, participants always see these questions: how many tiles in row 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 are occupied by ships? How many ships are horizontal? And are the, for example, red and blue ship parallel? So as you can kind of tell here, participants might see different variants of these questions. So for example, you might see how many ships are 2 tiles long on one exposure trial and how many ships are 4 tiles long on a different exposure trial, but you're always seeing the same form of the question. And so we're kind of interested in reuse of these, what we might call like question templates, rather than the like specific questions themselves. Okay, so just to recap the method, we have the exposure 1 condition where participants are exposed to question set 1, then complete the question asking task. We have the exposure 2 condition where participants are exposed to question set 2 and then complete the question asking task. And we have the no exposure condition where participants go straight to the question asking task. And what we want to ask is how the questions that participants ask in the question asking task differ according to what kind of exposure, if any, participants received. Okay, so we gave these tasks to 107 adults on Amazon Mechanical Turk. We had several exclusion criteria, so we excluded questions that were off-topic, didn't follow the rules that we gave participants. They were ambiguous and that we couldn't tell what the participants were asking, or they couldn't be captured by an optimal model of how informative the questions were. So after these exclusions, this left us with a remaining sample of 445 questions from 56 participants, which is what I'm going to present the results for. So again, we're going to be addressing these 2 questions. And so first, let's start with, do people just reuse previously asked questions in general? To answer those questions, we coded the questions that participants asked as belonging to question set 1, question set 2, or neither. And we did this coding, again, based on like the meaning of the question and not the specific phrasing. So to give an example, all of these questions were coded as examples of this exposed question. So you could say how many ships are length 2, and that would still count as asking how many ships are 2 tiles long. So here I'll be showing the proportion of questions asked in the question asking task that belonged to question set 1 in yellow, question set 2 in green, or neither of those sets in blue for the 3 conditions along the x-axis. In the no exposure condition, we see that these questions are relatively rare without any exposure, and we designed the task to have this structure. We selected these questions as questions that were relatively rare in prior work using this task. But we see in the exposure 1 condition that nearly half of participants' questions come from question set 1, and we see a similar pattern in the exposure 2 condition, and these condition differences are significant for both question sets. So people frequently reuse the questions to which they're exposed. Do they do this specifically when those questions are informative? Are people still sensitive to how informative these reused questions are? There are a few different ways we can look at this in our data, and I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A if people are curious about it. But for now, I'm going to talk through one way to kind of look at this. So in looking at each question set, for example, looking at question set 1 here, if you want to reuse a question, you really have like 7 options here, right? You could ask the first question, you could ask 3 different variants of the second question, depending on how many tiles. You could ask 3 different variants of the third question, depending on the color. And so we might want to know, when people reuse questions, are they just like selecting any reused question at random, or are they doing this in a way that's still sensitive to how informative the question is going to be in the new situation that you found yourself in? So for each board in the question asking task, for example, this board, we measure how informative each of the possible reused questions is. We do this according to a measure that I mentioned briefly earlier called expected information gain. This basically allows us to put a number on each question that tells us how much it's expected to reduce the person's uncertainty about the true configuration of the ships under all of the hidden squares. Okay, and then we can compare the expected information gain, or EIG, of participants' questions, which I'm plotting here, to different models that select a reused question in different ways. So for example, a model that selects at random from the possible reused questions and therefore describes the average informativeness of possible reused questions asks significantly less informative questions than participants do when they're reusing questions. And so this demonstrates that people do seem to take into account how informative the question are. They're not just reusing indiscriminately. However, a model that selects the best possible or the most informative possible question on every trial significantly outperforms participants. And so participants' reused questions are reasonably but not maximally informative. Okay, finally, let's turn to this last question quickly because I'm running low on time. So when asking novel questions, do people reuse conceptual building blocks from previously asked questions? Or how does reuse kind of extend to this like compositional system? In other words, if we only look at these other questions that don't belong to question set 1 or question set 2 in the first analysis I presented, do they use the same conceptual building blocks as are contained in the 2 exposure question sets? To answer this question, we recoded the questions again, but this time instead of coding whether they matched these questions exactly, we coded whether the questions used similar or the same conceptual building blocks as are contained in these questions. And in particular, for each question, we identified one conceptual building block included in that question that wasn't contained in the other question set. And so this allows us to have a unique set of conceptual building blocks that we're looking at for the 2 sets of questions. And I'm happy to return to this in the Q&A, but this is just showing we have 3 different building blocks that we're looking at for question set 1 and 2 for question set 2 because there's some overlap in the building blocks used in question set 2. Okay, so here I'll be plotting a really similar plot to the first thing I showed, but again, now we're looking at reuse of the conceptual building blocks rather than the questions themselves. So in the no exposure condition, we see that these are much more commonly popping up in people's questions, even at baseline, especially the building blocks that we looked at from question set 1. If we look at the exposure 1 condition, though, we see a little bit more use of the question set 1 building blocks. And in the question set 2 condition, we see a little bit more use of the question set 2 building blocks. And these condition differences are significant for both of the question sets. And so this suggests that people do selectively reuse conceptual building blocks when they're asking new questions. Okay, so to summarize, I propose today that question reuse might be a strategy by which we narrow down the massive space of possible questions, enabling us to more efficiently search this space to find an informative question in new situations. In particular, when previously asked questions are informative, we might be able to just reuse them in our entirety, and we have evidence that people do this. But when they're not informative, we can still reuse the conceptual building blocks from those questions to help make our search for new questions a little bit more constrained. And so I presented evidence that's consistent with these 2 hypotheses, but I think this evidence really also opens up a ton of new questions that we're excited about exploring. For example, I'm curious how we know which conceptual building blocks to reuse in which situations, and how we actually combine those reused conceptual building blocks with new concepts to form new questions. And so hopefully our ongoing research will be able to contribute to our understanding of how people ask questions, and more generally, how people solve these large-scale search problems. So with that, I'll thank you all for your attention, and hopefully I can take a couple questions. Hi.
That was so great. Thank you for that. So I like this description of scientific education as learning how to ask good questions. So I was wondering 2 things. Do you see an improvement in the kinds of questions that people ask over the course of the game? So do you know anything about the time course of expected information game? And have you thought at all about maybe doing similar analyses, but in a more naturalistic context, looking at over the course of PhD education, do they start asking better questions at conferences or in seminars?
Yeah, those are great questions. Thank you so much. So for the first part of your question, in this task, we haven't looked over the trials, but I actually doubt that there would be much change because in this task, we can't actually answer participants' questions. So this all happens online on Amazon Mechanical Turk. And so since they're just typing into a text box, we have some practical limitations where it would be challenging to answer in real time participants' questions. Yeah. And so they don't get any feedback. And so for that reason, I'm not sure that they would improve. They do get feedback in the exposure phase, though. And so after they get the answer to whatever question they ranked as the best, and then they get shown the answer, and then they get to guess where the squares are, and then they get to see how accurate they were. And so one thing that might be interesting is you might think that those who got exposure would be generally better at asking informative questions than those who didn't get exposure, and we actually don't see that that's the case. And so even after getting 6 trials of exposure where you're seeing how the answer to the question that you ranked as best informs how you're then gonna paint the tiles on the grid, we see that the informativeness of questions in the exposure and the no exposure conditions are really similar. So it seems like there's no general boost of getting exposure. It's really specific to having you re-ask questions that you've seen before. And so, yeah, I think it would be something interesting to explore further. And I really like your second idea of kind of looking in more like naturalistic situations. I think one thing that's really nice about this task is it's, even though it's a large search space, it's very constrained, and so we can use these kind of like optimal models to quantify how informative people's questions are. We might even be able to kind of compare how people search the space of possible questions to a kind of actual grammar that we can define and build models that search through, and so that's something I'm excited about, but I really want to combine that with like more naturalistic question asking where we might not have the same level of experimental control and ability to model, but I think it can provide much more richer insights into question asking in the real world. And so one thing we're thinking about is trying to look at this in like developmental context, children learning how to ask questions, and I think that's something that might be able to shed further light on kind of how this happens in real world contexts. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very nice talk. Kind of similar to what he asked. Like, I'm wondering, like, if the reuse here, like, more serves as an anchor, or is I more providing more possibility? So one way I'm thinking it might be possible to answer this question is to have you check the diversity of the question, like in different conditions, like, is it the like is the exposure to the private question opening more possibility, or is the anchor in their mind so they are forced somehow to ask questions related to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think this gets somewhat back to what I was saying in response to the previous question, which is that there's no general effect of exposure on asking more informative questions in general. So it seems like, I guess one thing you might predict if it's like kind of broadening the space of possibilities, just like getting the exposure kind of shows you what's out there or something like that, that people would be able to find more informative questions than if they have this like broadened space of possibilities. But we don't see that they're better able to find more informative questions in general. But I think one could look at that more directly by actually looking at actually coding in a more fine-grained way at an individual level, like the diversity of the questions that people ask. And so I guess I haven't looked at that, but maybe looking like across the 10 trials, do people tend to ask like the same question on as many trials as they can, as long as it's reasonably informative, and then only switch them when they need to? Or do people kind of still generate a reasonable diversity of questions, but like drawing from kind of different samples? And that's something I haven't looked at the data yet, but I agree would be really cool to look at. So yeah, thank you.
Very nice presentation. For context, I'm coming at this from a robotics and cognitive systems perspective. And so this was really interesting because in the robotics community, there's been a lot of work on enabling robots to ask good questions. So trying to use similar information theoretic perspectives to choose the question that will allow the robot to gain the most information. But you could also look at this from the more of a cognitive systems problem-solving perspective, in which you might be asking a question because it is sort of a strategy that you have cached that has been a good solution to this problem in the past. And so this sort of led me to the question of how you're thinking about this notion of informativity. Is this, what question could I ask that is going to be maximally informative right now? Or what question, based off of my previous experience, do I have the largest positive association with, because in the past it was a really informative question for me to ask in other situations in which I've been in a similar case?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I think one thing I will say is I would point you to this Morris et al. 2021 paper, which is not in the domain of question asking at all. They're looking at kind of decision-making sorts of problems like deciding what to cook for dinner, but what they're looking at is kind of a dissociation of how good an option has been in the past and how good it is in the current situation. And I hope I'm saying this faithfully. What they find is that there's kind of how good it is in the past determines how likely it is to like come to mind, but how good it is in the current situation determines how likely you are to actually select it after it comes to mind. And so I think that it's possible that sort of dynamic would apply to question asking too. And I think there's kind of a dissociation between those two things, as you point out. And so I think it would be interesting to try to replicate those results in the context of question asking. I mean, I think what we ideally want people to do is ask a question that's informative in the current context, because you're going to find yourself in new situations where previously asked questions aren't going to be so helpful. And so even if a question was good in the past, that doesn't mean it always will be in the current situation, but there might be a trade-off where that might be a more like computationally efficient way to think of a reasonably good guess for a question, and then you might only kind of decide to consider alternatives if then you come up with that question, maybe evaluate it, and then if it's not good enough, you could switch. And so I think doing something like that and really looking at kind of like the dynamics of like how this unfolds over time as people, like, can we kind of track like what questions people are thinking of, whether they're gonna like choose that or go to a different question, I think would be really, really interesting to get a better sense of like how this kind of process unfolds. Yeah, thank you. I think we should wrap up. Yeah, so thank you so much. Really appreciate it.